Ma'am, you need to lower that scarf. Now. I can't, the woman whispered. Please. Just let me sit. If no one intervened in the next few minutes, she would be forced off the plane, and the truth she was protecting would be exposed to hundreds of strangers, costing her the one thing she could never get back, her dignity. The cabin lights hummed softly, too bright for such a quiet confrontation. Overhead bins slammed shut one by one, sharp and final, like doors closing on options. A flight attendant stood rigid in the aisle, fingers tight around a laminated rule card. Passengers leaned into the aisle, pretending not to stare while staring anyway. The woman in 14C kept her face turned toward the window, her black scarf pulled high, hands trembling in her lap. The plane was already late. You could feel it in the air, the restless shifting, the clipped sighs, the way a man across the aisle checked his watch again, then again. Someone muttered, "We're never getting out of here." Another voice, lower, edged with irritation, "Why won't she just comply?" The woman's name was Evelyn Carter, and she hadn't boarded this flight lightly. Her shoulders were squared, but her breath came shallow. Beneath the scarf, something pressed against the fabric, changing the natural line of her face. She kept one hand there, as if holding a secret in place. When the flight attendant leaned closer, lowering her voice but not her authority, Evelyn flinched. "It's standard procedure," the attendant said. "Faces must be visible during boarding." "I understand the rule," Evelyn replied, her voice steady but thin. "But the rule doesn't apply to me." "Not today." That was the first hint, small, almost invisible, that this wasn't what it looked like. A child a few rows back kicked the seat rhythmically. The engines outside whined, then fell silent. Boarding had stopped. Everyone knew it. Everyone felt it. Time thickened, stretching each second longer than the last. The attendant straightened. "If you don't comply, I'll have to call the captain." Evelyn closed her eyes. Just for a moment. As if counting. As if bracing. What no one around her knew, what the rule card didn't explain, was that lowering that scarf wouldn't just reveal her face. It would reveal evidence. Proof of something that had happened less than 48 hours earlier. Something still raw. Something documented. Something that would force questions no one on that plane was ready to answer. A man in a gray jacket stood halfway out of his seat, then hesitated. The attendant reached for the intercom. And Evelyn whispered, barely audible, "Please! We're almost out of time." The plane remained frozen at the gate, suspended between policy and humanity, while a truth waited, pressed beneath black fabric, ready to come out mid-flight whether anyone wanted it to or not. Enjoying this? Tap subscribe for tomorrow's story. The captain hadn't been called yet, but everyone felt him coming. Evelyn Carter sat perfectly still in seat 14C, eyes fixed on the oval of gray sky beyond the window. Her reflection stared back faintly, broken by the curve of the glass. The black scarf covered everything below her eyes, wrapped carefully, deliberately. Not hastily. Not in panic. This was practiced. Across the aisle, the flight attendant, Ms. Laura Finch, according to the name stitched on her navy vest, took a slow breath. She wasn't cruel. She wasn't loud. That was what made her firmness harder to push against. "I'm trying to help you, Miss Carter," Laura said, keeping her voice even. "But the rule is clear. Faces must be visible during boarding for identification." Several passengers nodded instinctively, as if the rule had been theirs all along. "That's right," a man 2 rows up said. "Security reasons." A woman near the aisle added, "We all had to do it." The rule felt solid because it sounded reasonable. That's how most rules gain power, not through force, but through familiarity. Evelyn didn't argue. That unsettled people. She didn't raise her voice or accuse anyone of anything. She simply shook her head once, small and precise, and said, "I've already been cleared." Laura frowned. "Cleared by whom?" Evelyn hesitated. Just a fraction too long. The hesitation landed like a spark. A low murmur moved through the cabin. The man in gray sat back down, but he didn't relax. His eyes stayed on Evelyn, searching for something, anything, that would make this simpler. Laura lifted the laminated rule card again, more for herself than anyone else. She had followed this procedure dozens of times. Maybe hundreds. The steps were muscle memory: request, explain, escalate. I don't see any notation on the manifest, Laura said. If you have documentation, I need to see it. Evelyn's fingers tightened in her lap. Under the scarf, her breathing changed, shallower now, quicker. It's not something I can hand you, she said. That answer tipped the balance. A man near the window muttered, Then what are we doing here? The plane felt smaller by the second. Laura pressed the intercom button but didn't speak yet. Her thumb hovered there, the way it does when someone knows the next step is irreversible. Miss Carter, she said, quieter now. If I involve the captain, this will escalate. Evelyn finally turned from the window. Her eyes met Laura's, dark, steady, and pleading without being weak. I know, Evelyn said. That's what I'm trying to prevent. That sentence didn't fit the story everyone else was telling themselves. Because in their version, this was about compliance. About rules. About one passenger holding up an entire flight. But Evelyn wasn't afraid of being late. She wasn't afraid of being removed. She was afraid of being seen before she was ready. And there was one detail, small, easily missed, that hadn't escaped Laura Finch. As Evelyn shifted slightly in her seat, the scarf slipped just enough to reveal a corner of white beneath it. Not skin. Not bandage tape. Medical gauze. Laura's hand froze on the intercom. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. Miss Carter, are you injured? Evelyn didn't answer right away. Then she said very softly, Yes. And if this goes the way you're thinking, everyone will see how. Laura straightened slowly, the rule card suddenly feeling thin in her hand. Because now this wasn't just about a policy everyone believed in. It was about whether the policy knew when to step aside. And the captain was already on his way down the jet bridge. The captain stopped just inside the aircraft door. He didn't announce himself. He didn't need to. The posture gave him away, the stillness of someone used to rooms going quiet when he entered. Captain Daniel Morris, late 50s, silver at the temples, scanned the aisle once and understood immediately where the tension lived. Laura Finch met him halfway. Sir, she said under her breath, we have a compliance issue. Passenger in 14C. Captain Morris followed her gaze. Evelyn Carter sat with her back straight, hands folded, eyes forward again. She looked calm to anyone who didn't know what to look for. But the captain had flown long enough to recognize controlled fear. The kind that comes from someone who has already endured worse than embarrassment. What's the issue? He asked. Face covering, Laura said. During boarding. The captain nodded slowly. Standard rule. Yes, Laura replied. Then, after a beat, but there may be circumstances. The word hung there. Captain Morris stepped into the aisle, careful not to block anyone's view completely. He crouched slightly so he wasn't towering over Evelyn. That, too, was intentional. Ma'am, he said, calm and professional. I'm Captain Morris. Can you tell me why you're unable to comply? Evelyn didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked, not to him, but to the passengers closest by. The man in gray. The woman with folded arms. The child still kicking the seat. This was the part the rule never addressed. Rules assumed privacy. Real life rarely provided it. I can explain, Evelyn said finally. But not like this. Captain Morris glanced up and down the aisle. Too many ears. Too many cameras, even if no one had raised a phone yet. We can step into the galley, he offered. Evelyn's hand tightened at her scarf. I can't stand for long. That was another detail. Quiet. Heavy. The captain absorbed that. Then he did something that surprised Laura. He turned to her and said, What exactly does the policy require? Laura blinked. Visible face during boarding for identification. And when is identification complete? He asked. At the gate, she said automatically. Boarding pass, ID verification. Which she's already passed, Captain Morris said. Yes, but the rest, he finished, is customary. Not mandatory. Laura looked down at the laminated card again. She had never read it that way. No one had. Custom had hardened into law without anyone noticing. Captain Morris turned back to Evelyn. Ms. Carter, is there a medical reason you're covering your face? Evelyn nodded once. Yes. Documented? Yes. Recent? Yes. Each answer tightened the cabin further. The man in gray shifted uncomfortably. The woman with folded arms uncrossed them. Something in the air changed, not sympathy yet, but uncertainty. Captain Morris straightened. Then here's what we'll do, he said loud enough for the nearest rows to hear. We'll finish boarding. A ripple moved through the cabin. But Captain, Laura began. I'll review the documentation privately once we're airborne, he said gently. That satisfies both policy and dignity. Dignity. The word landed harder than any rule. Evelyn's shoulders sagged just slightly, like a weight had been eased but not removed. Thank you, she said. The captain nodded once and turned away. As he did, the scarf shifted again, no more than before, but this time, the man in gray saw something else beneath the gauze. A faint line. Dark. Uneven. Not an injury from surgery. Something else. He looked away quickly, unsettled by a realization he couldn't yet name. The plane doors closed with a hollow thud. The engines began to hum. And Evelyn closed her eyes, knowing the hardest part still lay ahead. Because the rule everyone believed in wasn't the one that would test her. It was the one no one talked about. 48 hours earlier, Evelyn Carter had stood in front of a bathroom mirror that no longer felt like hers. The light above it flickered once before settling into a harsh white glow. It showed everything. Too much. She leaned closer, gripping the porcelain sink until her knuckles faded. Her face looked unfamiliar, not ruined, not broken, but changed. Swollen along the cheekbone. Discolored beneath the eye. A thin, jagged line ran from the edge of her jaw toward her ear, half hidden by carefully placed gauze. She touched it once. Then withdrew her hand. The knock at the door came softly. Ms. Carter? A woman's voice called. It's Nurse Helen. Evelyn took a breath, wrapped the scarf higher, and opened the door. The hospital room smelled faintly of antiseptic and old coffee. Morning sunlight pushed through half-closed blinds, striping the floor. Nurse Helen stood with a clipboard held close to her chest, eyes kind but alert, the eyes of someone who had seen too much to assume anything. Your discharge papers are ready, Helen said. Do you feel steady? Evelyn nodded. Steadier than yesterday. That was true. Yesterday, the world had tilted every time she moved. Yesterday, she hadn't been able to form full sentences without shaking. Helen glanced at the scarf. She didn't ask about it. Instead, she said, Transportation arranged? Yes, Evelyn replied. I'm flying. Helen's pen paused. Today? This afternoon? Helen hesitated. Has anyone discussed documentation with you? Evelyn exhaled slowly. The social worker did. The word social worker still sounded unreal, like something that belonged to other people's lives. Helen nodded. Good. Then you know your options. Options. Evelyn had learned quickly how limited those were. 2 days earlier, before the mirror, before the scarf, she had been in a different room entirely. A narrow office with gray walls and a desk that wobbled. A uniformed officer had asked questions in a calm, practiced tone, as if reading from a script that assumed she might change her story. He had asked her to repeat herself. He had asked her why she hadn't reported sooner. He had asked her whether she had been drinking. Each question had felt like a small erasure. What he hadn't asked, what no one asked out loud, was how a woman learned to measure danger in familiar footsteps. The social worker had been the first to say, This is documented. She had slid a folder across the desk. Inside were photographs Evelyn didn't want to look at again. Medical notes, Timestamps. A temporary protective order request unsigned. You don't have to decide everything today, the woman had said. But you should keep copies. Especially if you travel. Travel. That was the word that brought the fear rushing back. Because leaving meant being seen. At the hospital, Helen handed Evelyn a thick envelope. Keep this with you, she said. Not in your checked bag. Evelyn accepted it, the weight heavier than paper should be. What if someone asks? Evelyn said quietly. Helen met her gaze. Then you tell them only what you choose. Evelyn nodded, but they both knew the truth. Choice was fragile. It depended on timing. On strangers. On rules interpreted by people who had never stood in front of that mirror. As Evelyn signed the discharge form, her phone buzzed. A reminder notification lit the screen. Flight 318, departure 2:40 p.m. She stared at it longer than necessary. 48 hours earlier, she hadn't known she would be boarding that plane with her face hidden, not from guilt, but from exposure. She folded the envelope carefully and slipped it into her bag. Outside the hospital, the sky was painfully blue. And Evelyn wondered how many people believed rules were enough to keep them safe. The seatbelt light blinked once. Then it stayed on. A soft chime followed, polite but firm, and the hum of the engines deepened as the plane began to roll back from the gate. Conversations dropped into murmurs. The aisle finally cleared. What had felt like a public standoff minutes earlier was now sealed inside aluminum and air. Evelyn Carter fastened her seatbelt slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might undo the fragile calm. Her hand still shook, but less than before. The scarf stayed in place. The gauze beneath it pressed gently against her skin, a reminder that the past 48 hours were not behind her. They were simply quiet for the moment. Across the aisle, the man in the gray jacket avoided looking at her now. He stared straight ahead, jaw set, as if replaying something he hadn't fully seen but couldn't forget. Laura Finch moved through the cabin, checking belts, offering practice smiles. When she reached Evelyn's row, she paused just long enough to meet her eyes. We'll be in the air shortly, Laura said softly. Evelyn nodded. Thank you. Laura hesitated, then added, If you need anything, let me know. It wasn't an apology. But it wasn't just procedure anymore, either. The plane lifted with a low, steady roar. Pressure shifted. Ears popped. The ground fell away. Only then did Evelyn allow herself to breathe fully. She reached into her bag and felt the edge of the envelope without pulling it out. Thick paper. Official seals. Photographs she hoped no one else would ever see. It was proof, yes, but it was also a key. One she didn't yet know how to use. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, we're airborne. Flight time today will be just under 3 hours. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. 3 hours. Long enough for questions. Long enough for someone to decide the issue wasn't finished. As if on cue, Laura reappeared a few minutes later, not in the aisle this time, but leaning discreetly toward Evelyn. Captain Morris would like a word when you're comfortable, she said. Privately. Evelyn's throat tightened. Now? Not immediately, Laura replied. When the cabin settles. Evelyn nodded, her gaze dropping to her lap. This was the part she had known was coming. Because rules rarely end at takeoff. They just change form. As the plane leveled off, the seatbelt light finally clicked off. A few passengers stood, stretching stiff legs. Overhead bins opened again. Normal life resumed in pieces. But Evelyn stayed seated. She watched the aisle. She listened to the sounds of flight, the clink of a cart, the rustle of newspapers, the low drone beneath it all. And she wondered whether the truth she carried would remain contained, or whether it was already moving toward the light. Captain Morris didn't meet her in the cockpit. He chose the small galley instead, the one tucked between first class and the forward cabin. It was quieter there, shielded from curious eyes by a narrow curtain and the steady work of the flight attendants pretending not to listen. Miss Carter, he said, gesturing to the jump seat. Please. Sit. Evelyn lowered herself carefully. Standing that long made her lightheaded. She kept one hand at her scarf, not adjusting it, just anchoring herself. I won't ask you to remove anything, the captain said before she could speak. That's not why I wanted to talk. Evelyn looked up, surprised despite herself. He held out a small tablet. Not a form. Not a warning. A checklist. I need to know whether there's a risk to you, or anyone else, if we continue as planned, he said. That's my responsibility. Evelyn nodded slowly. There isn't. Good, he said. Then, after a pause, and I need to know whether what you're carrying is evidence. The word landed softly, but it changed everything. Evelyn's breath caught. Just for a second. Yes, she said. Captain Morris didn't react the way she expected. No tightening of the jaw. No shift toward protocol. Instead, he nodded once, as if something had finally aligned. Then I need to ask you something else, he said. And you're free not to answer. Evelyn waited. Is the person responsible likely to be on this flight? Her fingers curled into the fabric of her scarf. No, she said. He's not. The captain exhaled, relieved in a way he didn't bother to hide. All right. He leaned back slightly, lowering his voice. Ms. Carter, I've been flying for 32 years. I've removed passengers for less than this. And I've protected people for more. Evelyn's eyes searched his face, trying to understand where this was going. There's a discretionary clause, he continued. Rarely used. Almost never talked about. It allows the captain to override visible identification customs when medical or legal vulnerability is present. Evelyn stared at him. I've never heard of that. Most people haven't, he said. Including most crew. He tapped the tablet once, then turned it so she could see. A policy header. Dry language. Small print. You qualify, he said simply. Something loosened in Evelyn's chest. Not relief, not yet, but validation. I'm not asking to see your documentation, he added. I'm asking whether you want this noted in the flight log. Her heart began to race. A log entry meant permanence. A record that couldn't be quietly forgotten. It also meant visibility, eventually. If it's logged, Evelyn said carefully. Who sees it? Operations, he replied. And compliance. And after that? Captain Morris met her gaze. That depends on whether someone asks why. Evelyn understood then. This wasn't just about protecting her. It was about creating a trail. She thought of the mirror. The envelope. The question she'd already answered too many times. Yes, she said. Log it. The captain nodded. All right. He stood, drawing the curtains slightly wider. Ms. Carter, he said, voice firm now, carrying just enough authority to reach beyond the galley. You're safe on this flight. As he stepped away, Evelyn realized something with a chill that had nothing to do with altitude. The truth wasn't just protected anymore. It was moving forward. Evelyn returned to her seat with the curtain barely settling behind her. At first, nothing looked different. Passengers were still scrolling, sipping drinks, murmuring about connections and weather. The man in the gray jacket still faced forward. Laura Finch still moved with measured efficiency. Normal had reasserted itself so smoothly it almost felt intentional. Almost. Then the first change rippled through the cabin. A flight attendant, not Laura, approached Evelyn's row and stopped. She leaned down slightly, voice low. Ms. Carter, she said, careful with the name. The captain asked me to let you know he's made a notation in the flight log. Several heads lifted. Not fully. Just enough. Evelyn nodded. Thank you. The attendant added. If you need privacy at any point, please tell us. That was when the man in gray turned. He looked at Evelyn, then at the scarf, then at the attendant walking away. Something clicked, slowly, uncomfortably. Log entries weren't routine. Everyone who flew often knew that. Laura Finch appeared a moment later, holding a small tray. She set a cup of water on Evelyn's tray table. "On the house," she said quietly. Then, after a pause, "Captain's courtesy." Evelyn met her eyes. Laura's expression had changed. Not guilt. Not fear. Respect. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband and whispered, "They logged it." "What does that mean?" he asked. "It means it's serious," she replied. The cabin had noticed. Not with accusation, but with recalibration. The story people had been telling themselves was unraveling. This wasn't a stubborn passenger anymore. This wasn't someone holding up a flight for personal reasons. This was someone the captain had chosen to protect. The man in gray swallowed and looked down at his hands. He remembered the faint line he'd seen beneath the gauze. The way Evelyn had flinched, not when challenged, but when surrounded. He leaned slightly into the aisle as Laura passed again. "Excuse me," he said. Was I wrong earlier?" Laura paused. Chose her words carefully. "You were missing information." That was enough. A few rows back, someone lifted a phone, then thought better of it, and put it away. Evelyn felt the shift like a pressure change. Not everyone understood. But enough did. She took a sip of water. Her hands were steadier now. Because the truth, once acknowledged by authority, had weight. And it was no longer hers alone to carry. But the story wasn't finished yet. Not even close. The wheels touched down with a jolt that traveled through the cabin like a held breath finally released. Applause broke out in a few scattered claps, then faded. Phones came back on. Bags were pulled from under seats. The ordinary rituals of arrival resumed, but something lingered beneath them, unresolved. Evelyn Carter stayed seated as the plane taxied to the gate. She had learned, over the past 2 days, that moving too quickly invited attention. And attention, when poorly timed, had consequences. When the seatbelt light went off, the aisle filled immediately. People stood, stretched, complained softly about delays. The man in the gray jacket rose with the rest, then hesitated. He glanced back at Evelyn, opened his mouth, and closed it again. Laura Finch approached her row instead of moving forward with the others. "Ms. Carter," she said quietly, "Captain Morris would like you to remain seated until the aisle clears." A few nearby passengers heard. No one objected. Evelyn nodded. She didn't ask why. She already knew. When the last passenger passed, Captain Morris appeared at the front of the cabin. He waited until the door was open, until ground staff stood ready outside, then stepped closer. "There will be a brief follow-up," he said. "Standard when a discretionary clause is used." "Am I in trouble?" Evelyn asked. "No," he said immediately. "You're on record." On record. 2 uniformed airline compliance officers waited just beyond the jet bridge. They were polite. Professional. They asked Evelyn to step aside, not out of sight, but out of the flow. One of them, Mr. Alan Brooks, consulted a tablet. "Ms. Carter, we see the log entry. Medical and legal vulnerability noted mid-flight." "Yes," Evelyn said. "We won't ask you to disclose anything publicly," he continued. "But we do need to verify that the notation was appropriate." Evelyn opened her bag and removed the envelope for the first time since boarding. She didn't hand it over right away. She held it. "This contains medical documentation and a police report number," she said. "I'll show you only what's relevant." Brooks nodded. "That's acceptable." As she revealed just enough, dates, signatures, official stamps, his demeanor shifted. The questions stopped sounding procedural and started sounding careful. "I'm sorry this happened to you," he said finally. Evelyn said nothing. She had learned apologies mattered only when followed by action. Captain Morris observed quietly, arms folded. When Brooks finished, he turned to the captain. "The notation stands," Brooks said. "And this will be reviewed." "Good," the captain replied. "Reviewed how?" Evelyn asked. Brooks met her eyes. "As a training issue. And a policy clarification." Evelyn felt a strange mix of relief and exhaustion. Because fallout wasn't loud. It didn't look like justice in movies. It looked like forms. Memos. Quiet accountability. As she stepped into the terminal, scarf still in place, Evelyn realized something else had landed with the plane. The rule everyone believed in had been tested. And it hadn't held. 3 weeks later, the memo went out. It wasn't dramatic. No press conference. No public apology. Just a carefully worded update routed through internal channels: training, compliance, cabin operations. But for the people who read it, everything shifted. The language was precise. Visible identification customs during boarding are subordinate to documented medical or legal vulnerability. Crew are instructed to defer to captain discretion and prioritize passenger dignity. Dignity. The word appeared twice. Laura Finch read the memo at her kitchen table, coffee cooling beside her. She read it once. Then again. Then she closed her laptop and sat very still. She thought of seat 14C. Of the scarf. Of the way Evelyn Carter had said, "I understand the rule." Laura had believed she was enforcing safety. Now she understood she had been standing between a woman and her right to remain whole. The next time a similar situation arose, because there is always a next time, Laura didn't reach for the laminated card. She reached for the captain. Across the country, in a quiet apartment with morning light slanting through the blinds, Evelyn read the same update on a printed page. It had been mailed to her, along with a short note from airline compliance. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." She folded the paper carefully and placed it back in the envelope. The same envelope. Still thick. Still heavy. But different now. The bruise on her face had faded to yellow. The cut along her jaw had closed cleanly. She still wore the scarf when she went out, not because she had to, but because healing wasn't linear. What mattered was this: the next woman wouldn't have to explain herself in an aisle full of strangers. The next captain would have language to stand on. And the next flight wouldn't stall at the gate because a rule had outgrown its purpose. Change didn't arrive all at once. But it arrived. And it stayed. The airport looked different when Evelyn Carter returned. Not because it had changed, but because she had. It was early morning, the kind that softened everything with pale light. Coffee steamed in paper cups. Wheels hummed over tile. Announcements echoed gently, less urgent than she remembered. Evelyn stood near the gate, uncovered. No scarf. Her face bore only a faint line now, barely visible unless you knew where to look. It no longer felt like something to hide. It felt like a seam, where something had been torn and carefully stitched back together. At the counter, a gate agent glanced up, smiled, and said, "Good morning, Miss Carter." No pause. No extra look. Evelyn returned the smile. When boarding began, a woman 2 places ahead hesitated at the scanner, adjusting a head covering. The agent leaned forward, lowered her voice, and nodded reassuringly. "Take your time," she said. "You're all set." Evelyn watched the woman's shoulders ease. She didn't intervene. She didn't need to. Some changes worked best when they became invisible. On the plane, Evelyn took her seat by the window. As the aircraft pushed back, sunlight flashed across the wing, clean and bright. The engines rose into a steady, confident hum. She closed her eyes, not to brace herself, but to rest. 6 months earlier, she had boarded in fear, guarding a truth that felt too heavy to carry alone. Now, that truth had weight in the right places. Policies had names. Training had language. Dignity had a definition that didn't depend on how loudly someone could ask for it. As the plane lifted, Evelyn opened her eyes and looked out over the city shrinking below. She wasn't leaving something behind this time. She was moving forward, whole. Yendi, thanks for watching.